He is introduced in whispers and in thunder, a singular force who made defenders doubt their courage and statisticians revise their sense of what was possible. Jim Brown, already a legend by the time most athletes are still proving themselves. So what made Jim Brown literally unstoppable? The answer begins far from the bright lights, in the shape of a young life formed by toughness, talent, and a refusal to be contained, then moves through a career that bent the history of American sport and spilled beyond it into culture, activism, and film, where he chose, again and again, the path of his own making. He was born James Nathaniel Brown in 1936 and raised between Georgia and Long Island, developing not just the survival instincts of a kid who learned early to rely on himself, but the coordination and strength of an athlete who could do nearly anything with a ball in his hands. At Manhasset High School, he became a rare multi-sport phenomenon, the sort of competitor who made coaches in different departments quietly adjust practice plans because they knew they were lucky just to have him that day. The gift wasn't only physical, it was a way of calculating angles, contact, and leverage, a patience mixed with ferocity that would define him later. When he arrived at Syracuse University, that breadth exploded. Football, basketball, track, and lacrosse, where he was so dominant that the sport changed because of him. As a midfielder, he bulldozed through checks and clung to the ball with such power and poise that the game instituted a requirement to keep the stick in motion, a response commonly nicknamed the Jim Brown Rule, a small but telling acknowledgement that everyday solutions didn't work on him. He loved lacrosse so much he once said he would have chosen it professionally if that had been an option. He became a two-time All-American and later the first African-American inducted into the National Lacrosse Hall of Fame. The core of his legend, speed through contact, balance under punishment, calm when chaos thickened, was already there in orange and white, then carried effortlessly to the heavier collisions of autumn Saturdays. Cleveland called in 1957, drafting him in the first round, and any idea that he might need time to grow into the professional game evaporated immediately. The rookie season was a statement. League rushing champion, Rookie of the Year by unanimous acclamation, and Most Valuable Player honors from major outlets, an alignment of awards that told an old league it had a new center of gravity. He didn't just fit into Paul Brown's system, he redefined its priorities. Even with a coach renowned for discipline and detail, a rookie with Brown's strength and field vision demanded the ball and found ways to tilt each snap to his advantage. He ran with an almost clinical violence, hips low, knees high, hands soft, eyes always seeing the next defender folding into the ground. And when defenses sold out to stop him, he caught passes, returned kicks, or simply absorbed the punishment and returned the next week without complaint. In 9 years, he never missed a game, a fact as revealing as any number in a book of superlatives. The rise was relentless, but it was never only about accumulation. By 1963, he produced a single-season rushing total of 1,863 yards that made coaches reconsider what a running offense could be. And he did it in 14 games, a measure of pace that still humbles the modern eye. In an era when passing was not yet king, opponents built entire plans around him and still watched him skate past the edge, then turn upfield as if the sideline were a suggestion, not a limit. By the time he left the field for the last time, he held the league's career records for rushing yards with 12,312, for rushing touchdowns with 106, for total touchdowns with 126, and for all-purpose yards with over 15,000, a cluster of marks that felt less like a list than the imprint of a force. He averaged 5.2 yards per carry across his career, distance down after down, equivalent to a first down every 2 touches, while peaking at 6.4 yards per carry in that astonishing 1963 campaign. He led the league in rushing 8 times and became a 9-time Pro Bowler with 8 unanimous first-team All-NFL selections, an unmatched consistency that underscored how little opponents could do to alter the outcome when he decided where a game would be played. Between the tackles, on the perimeter, or on their overwhelmed shoulders. There were performances that still live in city lore, games where the Browns appeared second to his will. Cleveland, a town that measures its heart in autumn, watched him power a team to the 1964 NFL Championship, the last major title of that era for the franchise, a reminder that his greatness was not a private pursuit, but a shared inheritance. He didn't merely pile up yards when the schedule softened. He bent big moments to his purposes and demanded that teammates and opponents accept the fact. He caught 262 passes for 2,499 yards, threw 3 touchdowns, and returned kicks just to widen the possible ways a game could turn in Cleveland's favor. Those aren't novelties, they're dimensions, ways of showing that if a defense built a wall in one place, he would go over it, around it, or through it, and force calculation to yield to impact. At 6 feet 2 and roughly 230 pounds, he accelerated like a sprinter and finished like a heavyweight, an unusual combination that left linebackers guessing and cornerbacks reluctant, and he did it within a context where the season was shorter, the spaces tighter, and the cruelty of the job more transparent. When modern fans compare numbers across eras, they often forget the toll of those years. Brown's pace, adjusted for fewer games and a constant diet of stacked fronts, remains a measure of dominion. Yet the reason he became a legend isn't sealed by accounting. It's in the way he ran after contact, in that gliding stride that disguised torque and leg drive, and in his habit of rising slowly after tackles. A bit of theater that made defenders wonder whether they'd finally slowed him, only to learn he was resetting the tempo on his terms. He turned defensive arrangements into a sequence of one-on-ones, and in that narrowed focus he was unbeatable. Shifting the ball, using an arm like a lever, slipping through the near gap, always finishing forward. Even at Syracuse, his lacrosse instincts, change of speed, deception through posture, the constant threat of cutting against the grain, bled into football, making him uncommonly slippery for a man of his size. When people describe him as unstoppable, they're talking as much about inevitability as about force. There is a kind of authority in sports that owes nothing to volume and everything to outcomes, and Brown carried it from snap to snap. As his fame expanded, so did the contours of his influence. He retired in July 1966 at age 30, at the absolute crest of his powers, after a public standoff with Brown's owner Art Modell over whether he would leave a film set in England to report to training camp. He refused to be rushed back from the Dirty Dozen, wrote a letter that asserted his right to choose his path, and walked away from football, not as surrender or distraction, but as an assertion of self that echoed far beyond the locker room. In that moment, he was saying that greatness doesn't require permission, and that an athlete's identity cannot be fully owned by a schedule. His choice startled a league accustomed to control, and in time, helped pioneer the notion that star players possessed leverage beyond the field. It was, in its way, an act of quiet activism. Hollywood opened its doors wider than it ever had for a black athlete-turned-actor. The Dirty Dozen made him a bankable on-screen presence. Ice Station Zebra followed, and in 100 Rifles, he shared a controversial love scene with Raquel Welch that challenged and changed old studio taboos around race and intimacy. Between 1967 and 1970, he crossed boundaries that had nothing to do with yardage markers and everything to do with what leading men could look like and whom they could love on screen. In that stretch, he became, for a time, the first black action star of the modern era, a figure who refused the old compromises and demanded full complexity. The cultural power of that pivot, athlete to actor, icon on Sunday to barrier breaker on Friday night, was an extension of the same principle that drove his runs. Momentum sustained by conviction. Off the screen, he leaned into community action and economic empowerment. In the 1960s, he helped found the Negro Industrial Economic Union to support black-owned businesses, emphasizing ownership and self-determination at a moment when protests filled the streets and policy lagged behind demands for dignity. In 1967, he convened the Cleveland Summit, gathering prominent black athletes to support Muhammad Ali's conscientious refusal of military induction, a meeting that placed athlete activism on a national stage and modeled a kind of strategic solidarity that would echo decades later. Years afterward, he launched the Amer I Can program, focused on redirecting the lives of gang-involved youth, an effort rooted in accountability and mentorship rather than headlines. His politics could be idiosyncratic, sometimes drawing criticism from different corners, but his insistence on agency, over body, career, business, and community, never wavered. There is a line from the way he chose his holes on a muddy field to the way he chose his fights in public life. Deliberate, often defiant, always his. That stance gave him admirers and detractors alike, which is another way of saying he mattered. Comparisons are unavoidable, and in his case, they serve rather than diminish. Against the all-timers who came after him, backs who played longer in 16 and 17-game seasons, behind lines trained in schemes that did not yet exist in his day, Brown's average per carry and per season remains a high bar. He left the game still holding the major rushing records, a rarity for athletes who retire early, and a testament to how far ahead of the field he had run. He didn't just excel, he reset denominators. When followers argue across eras, they must account for his shorter seasons, the concentration of defensive attention, the relative lack of substitution and specialization, and the fact that he did more with fewer opportunities. He is that uncomfortable fact in any barstool debate. The man who left at 30 with the book still open and still read as definitive. There were controversies and conflicts along the way, moments when his private life and public persona collided and forced hard questions about power, responsibility, and change. He could be blunt, impatient with what he saw as posturing, and capable of alienating people who expected a simpler hero. Yet his reputation as a teammate was grounded in reliability, never absent, always productive, and the broader culture recognized his departure and subsequent success not as a disappearance, but as an evolution. The Browns enshrined him as their standard. The league welcomed him into the Hall of Fame in 1971, and his numbers, aura, and example became part of the shared language of football greatness. Even his last official act as a player, a 3-touchdown flourish in the 1966 Pro Bowl, read like a signature, a clear period at the end of a sentence everyone could still hear being spoken. When he passed away in May 2023 at 87, the remembrances stitched together a full portrait. Not just the yardage and trophies, but the influence on film, on athlete autonomy, on civic ambition. In Cleveland, the timeline of football hope always circles back to him. In Syracuse, the lacrosse fields still carry the echo of his strides. Across the sport, running backs wear his number with a kind of private reverence. His legacy is the combination of relentless production and deliberate choice, the understanding that domination on the field means little if the person carrying the ball cannot determine where he's going next. That's what made him unstoppable, the unity of will and ability, the calm insistence that the first hit would not be the last word, and the courage to walk away when others thought the story had more pages to turn. In a game that exalts collisions, Brown mastered the art of continuing. Through contact, through era, through expectation. The question now, for anyone watching today's greats, is simple and hard. In a world of bigger stages and longer seasons, who else can control outcomes with such quiet authority? And who will have the nerve to decide, as he did, exactly when to stop running?